Good evening, everybody. My name is Professor Stephen McKinney. I am from the University of Glasgow. I'm also one of the trustees, Medieval Glasgow Trust, and a very, very warm welcome, not just to this event, but to our St Mungo Festival in 2022. Traditionally, this opening lecture has launched the festival, although we did have an event on Saturday, which was very well attended, opening up the Vita Kentigern, and thanks to all those who attended that. But a warm welcome to the festival. At the very end, I'll talk about some of the highlights that are going to be taking place over the next couple of weeks. But tonight we've got the opening lecture, and it's an enormous pleasure for me to introduce Dr. John Davies, also from the University of Glasgow, who is going to be delivering this evening's lecture. Dr. John Reuben Davies read theology at the University of Durham, where he focused on church history and liturgy. He then gained his PhD at the University of Cambridge in the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic. Dr. Davies' interests in the cult of the saints led him to a position in the Department of Scottish History in the University of Edinburgh in 2004, but he then moved wisely, I would say, to Glasgow in 2008 to join the history team there, where he is now a research fellow and associate director of the university's Arts and Humanities Research Institute, the Arts Lab. He has published on the ecclesiastical history of Great Britain in the Middle Ages and his special interests in ecclesiastical organisation, the cult of saints, the lives of the saints, and liturgy. His current and most recent work is on the diplomatic and paleography of medieval charters, monastic chronicles, the study of liturgy, and that includes liturgical theology as well as liturgical history and medieval Scottish law. He is also currently the editor of the Ennis Review, which is a fantastic accolade for him. He's going to talk tonight on St Kentigern as bishop and the origins of the diocese of Glasgow. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. John Reuben Davies.
No one here needs to be told that St Kentigern, also known as Mungo, is the patron saint of Glasgow. But he is co-patron too, with St Asaph, of Flanelli, a small cathedral city in North Wales, where I happen to come from. The significance of this connection will become apparent later. Kentigern's lifetime coincided roughly with another of the great saints of Scotland, Columba of Iona, as well as that other great monastic figure of the Irish sea zone, St Columbanus. But our knowledge of Kentigern is far less secure even than our knowledge of Palladius or Patrick. Perhaps the most secure knowledge we have of Kentigern is that he did exist, and that he died 1409 years ago, and that he is one of the heroes of what has become known as the Age of the Saints in early medieval Britain. The problem for the historian is that where there is a gap in our knowledge, there's always a temptation to fill it. When dealing with the Age of the Saints, historians from all eras, rather like the neo-Gothic architects of the 19th century, have either rebuilt ruined edifices or even pulled down old ones, reconstructing them according to specific ideals and contemporary needs. For those of us who have studied the 6th and 7th centuries, the exercise of writing its history can be likened to examining Barry and Pugin's Palace of Westminster by investigating the structure completed in 1870 to gain an impression of the medieval building that had burned down in 1834. If we're lucky, there might be a Westminster Hall or a St. Stephen's Cloister from the original complex, but the largest part is a later reinterpretation of an earlier edifice. and the magnificent overlay of a medieval ideal tends to embed itself in the popular imagination, so it becomes difficult to envisage the largely plain, unimpressive, higgledy-piggledy assemblage of combustible materials that stood there before. And in the case of the story of St. Mungo, we have nothing so certain as a Westminster Hall at the heart of the late structure. The root of the popular and tenacious picture of Kentigern is 12th century legendary biography, a genre of writing known as hagiography. And that picture is pervasive and influential. Several works in the genre of hagiography deal with Glasgow's patron. The earliest of these lives of St. Kentigern to have come down to us is a fragmentary one, written at the request of Herbert during his time as Bishop of Glasgow between 1147 and 1164, when David I and Malcolm IV were kings of the Scots, and Stephen and Henry II were kings of the English. The anonymous author of this first life of St. Kentigern gives an account of the conception and birth of the saint, but the surviving text breaks off early in the story. The best known life of St. Kentigern is a complete and full-length work by a monastic writer of the Cistercian order called Jocelyn of Furness, a well-known author of saints' lives in his time. The work is addressed to Jocelyn's Cistercian namesake, another Jocelyn, who had become Bishop of Glasgow in 1175 after serving as abbot of Melrose Abbey. We therefore know that this account of the saint's life was written during Bishop Jocelyn's time as Bishop of Glasgow, that is, between 1175 and 1199. All the stories that we know about St. Mungo and all the related lives and liturgical texts essentially derive from these two works, written nearly 600 years after the saint's death. But the historian doesn't lose heart at this point. Instead, we ask what these works can tell us about the importance of St. Mungo for the time when they were written. Let's turn first to the only unequivocal reference to Kentigern in a source earlier than the 12th century, a reference which concerns his death. Kentigern is mentioned in a text originally written at the heart of the southern Welsh kingdom of Dyfed. A clerk at St. David's, in compiling the earliest version of Annales Cambriae, composed an entry for the year 613 that states, "The death of Kentigern and of Bishop Dyfrig." This annal was probably entered in the last decade of the 8th century, nearly 200 years after the deaths of the Kentigern and Dyfrig to whom it refers. The annalist at St. David's was mainly concerned to record events relating to saints, bishops, and kings. There are only 3 exceptions: the death of Bede the priest in 735, the death of Cuthbert the abbot of Monk Wearmouth in 777, and the death of Jonathan, abbot of Abergele, in 856. In each case, the status of the person is explicitly defined because he's not a saint, a bishop, or a king. As history has no record of a king called Kentigern, this Kentigern must have been a bishop and probably was already venerated as a saint. Kentigern's name could have entered the annals from the notional body of annalistic notices of North Welsh or North British origin that is thought to have been incorporated by the original compiler of Annales Cambriae. In the late 8th century, therefore, a British bishop named Kentigern, probably from North Wales or North Britain, was a figure of sufficient importance in church history for his death date to be recorded by the annalists of South Wales. So, having established that Kentigern was a figure of historical reality, let us turn back to Jocelyn's legendary life of St. Kentigern, where our saint has been given various roles to play, among them founder of the Church of Glasgow and rescuer of the Christian faith in the Kingdom of Strathclyde. But the kingdom described by Jocelyn was not quite the same as that which flourished when Kentigern was alive, around the second half of the 6th century and beginning of the 7th. The 6th century realm had its headquarters in the seemingly impregnable fortress on the rock of Dumbarton, high above the north bank of the Clyde, and its territories encompassed the Clyde Valley and Ayrshire, perhaps reaching as far west as southern Argyll at times. In 870, the fortress of Clyde Rock was besieged and sacked by Irish-based Vikings, led by two kings, Olaf and Ivar. Almost straight away, the terms used in the sources change. Contemporary records speak of the death of the King of the Britons of Strathclyde, not of Dumbarton or Clyde Rock. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle speaks of the Strathclyde Welsh. These are the first times we hear of Strathclyde, and the change of usage tells of a political change too. The political shift meant a move much further upstream to govern on the south bank of the Clyde. By the late 9th century, Govan had the trappings of a major church centre, and by the 11th century possessed enough monumental sculpture to rival Iona. The church at Govan was dedicated to St. Constantine, a royal saint with an impressive sarcophagus shrine. This was surely a royal church, and a royal capital must have sat close by. Contemporary sources next begin referring to the Kingdom of Strathclyde as Cumberland in English and Cumbria in Latin. And circumstances signal a polity that stretched much further south than its predecessor, from the Clyde Valley to modern Cumberland, reaching as far as the River Emont near Penrith. British kings continued to rule Strathclyde into the 11th century, and the Brittonic dialect of the region, closely related to Welsh and known as Cumbric, along with its accompanying culture, survived in the heartlands of the kingdom at least as long. The last reference to the Kingdom of Strathclyde is in 1018, although it appears to have continued for at least another generation. But the relation of Kentigern and Glasgow to each other and to the historical picture I have just outlined remains to be defined. In Jocelyn's account, Bishop Kentigern's authority as bishop runs throughout the Kingdom of Strathclyde. The king whom Jocelyn makes the contemporary of Bishop Kentigern is Rhydderch, the Rhydderch ap Tidwal, king of Clyde Rock, known as a contemporary of St. Columba and therefore of Kentigern. Jocelyn describes how Rhydderch transferred the lordship and sovereignty of his kingdom to Kentigern. And by this literary device, Jocelyn has the Kingdom of Strathclyde live on in the contemporary Bishopric of Glasgow. The diocese is represented as the kingdom, and the bishop is the source of royal authority. Jocelyn next relates how Kentigern sought and received a papal bull, granting that he should be subject to no bishop, but rather should be styled and actually be the vicar and chaplain of the Pope. In this way, Jocelyn was explaining Glasgow's recently acquired status as special daughter of Rome, exempt from submission to an archbishop. For Glasgow had been defending its independence from the archbishops of York after the Great Rebellion of 1174, when William the Lion, King of Scots, having been captured, had submitted to Henry II, King of the English, and agreed to the subjection of the Church in Scotland to the English. In the immediately preceding chapters, St. Kentigern has founded the bishopric of Flanelli in North Wales. The legend is a heavy allusion to the Bishop of Glasgow's case for an archiepiscopal pallium, as Kentigern goes about founding bishoprics in other parts of Britain and consecrating other bishops. Related perhaps to this idea of church founding in Jocelyn of Furness's writing is the string of church dedications to Kentigern found in Cumberland, Dumfriesshire, Roxburghshire, Lanarkshire, and Lothian. But the historian is faced with a problem at this point. First, there are few signs that veneration of St. Kentigern was significant much before the 12th century. Secondly, the archaeological investigations of Professor Stephen Driscoll of the University of Glasgow show that prior to the 12th century, Glasgow itself was a place of limited consequence. The near absence of early medieval sculpture or other evidence from the 9th to 11th centuries suggests that when the Reformed diocese of Glasgow was set up in the early 12th century, a process overseen one way or another by King David, Glasgow had only a modest church, probably built of timber, serving a small rural population. That this church was dedicated to the British Bishop St. Kentigern or Mungo is an assumption, though perhaps a reasonable one. But a stone cross from the site of the present cathedral in the Northumbrian style of mid to 11th century date with a disc head does point to the increasing importance of the earlier church in the half century before the construction of David I's building, which was consecrated in 1136. And it's from the middle of the 11th century that we have the first hints that bishops were being consecrated for Strathclyde. The contrast between Glasgow and nearby Govan in the 9th to 11th centuries was nevertheless sharp. Govan Church was the rich centre for the veneration of the kingly saint Constantine, a church probably sponsored by the royal house of Strathclyde. So let's think how Jocelyn's story of a politically powerful, holy bishop called Kentigern, who effectively ruled Strathclyde and founded churches throughout Cumberland, Dumfriesshire, Roxburghshire, Lanarkshire, and Lothian, relates to what had been going on in the years just before he started writing. Sometime soon after 1107, Earl David, later to become King David, oversaw the creation of the Diocese of Glasgow. This is important to remember. The first Bishop of Glasgow proper, a Cumbrian called Michael, was consecrated by an Archbishop of York sometime between 1108 and 1114. Bishop Michael dedicated churches within the Diocese of York and held ordinations in Westmoreland, where he was eventually to be buried. His successor, Bishop John, was consecrated in about 1117 by a reforming Pope, Paschal II. The first cathedral was consecrated during John's time as bishop in 1136, and it's from the time of Bishop John, supported by King David, that we see the systematic promotion of St. Kentigern as a patron saint. We need not be concerned that veneration of St. Kentigern in this way appears to have been dormant or even forgotten down to the 12th century. Churches often benefit from a new patron and shrine if they're to be successful, and the new Bishopric of Glasgow would benefit from a bishop saint as patron to launch the new diocese, and Kentigern was known as just such a holy bishop who had founded the church in Strathclyde. For this reason, too, the veneration of St. Constantine at Govan had to be eclipsed. Just as the Diocese of Glasgow replaced the former kingdom of Strathclyde, so the bishop saint had to replace the royal saint. And as we've already seen, Jocelyn of Furness dealt with the situation deftly, telling his 12th century readers how King Constantine had been always subject to Bishop Kentigern, like his father King Rhydderch before him. Despite the evidence for the existence of earlier churches at several of the sites later known to be dedicated to St. Kentigern, one is nevertheless strongly led to infer that as late as 1133, St. Kentigern's cult was still either weak or absent in Cumberland. When in that year Henry I founded the Bishopric of Carlisle, we should notice that King David made no objection. In fact, 10 years earlier, David had carried out an inquiry to find out what properties properly belonged to Glasgow and had come across no ancient endowments of Glasgow in Cumberland. Geoffrey Barrow showed how in this process of inquiry, church dedications must have been taken as evidence that a church or parish formed part of the possessions of Glasgow. He thought it more likely that a dedication to Kentigern would have come first, and that claims on behalf of Glasgow followed, rather than once Glasgow's ownership was established, the Kentigern dedication was quickly applied as a species of name tag. A similar process can be seen happening in South Wales with the Bishopric of Llandaff, as it sought to establish possession of estates and churches under the patronage of St. Taylor, one of its patron saints. At the end of 1135, in response to Stephen's assumption of the English crown, King David had taken control of Carlisle and Newcastle, so effecting a restoration of Scottish authority which had been unthinkable during the reign of Henry I. David came to terms with King Stephen in February 1136 and formalized his possession of Cumbria, but relinquished Northumberland. A second treaty between the Scottish and the English kings was reached at Durham in April 1139, Stephen yielding rule between the Tees and the Tweed to David, where the Scottish king remained in control until his death in May 1153 at Carlisle Castle. It is, I think, during this period of Scottish control in Cumberland that we should place the flourishing of Kentigern's cult. The promotion of the cult at Glasgow was especially vigorous from this point on. The Scotichronicon, written in the 15th century, records a story of how King Henry I was angry at seeing that John, Bishop of Glasgow, was dedicating churches throughout Cumberland. Although the story is without authority and appears to be chronologically misleading, it nevertheless allows us to imagine a situation in which the Bishop of Glasgow acted in such a way, to Anglo-Norman dismay during the period of Scottish ascendancy in the area. So, the evidence from North Britain points towards a cult of St. Kentigern that may have existed in Glasgow before the 12th century, but which probably existed in the Lothian area too, as well as Dumfriesshire. With the foundation of the Diocese of Glasgow, the cult of Kentigern was relaunched and promoted as the saint came to embody the Diocese of Glasgow and Scottish royal influence, together with Glaswegian episcopal pretensions, stretched southwards once more, his cult expanded in Scottish-controlled Cumberland during the 12th century. The resurgence and renewed popularity of Kentigern's cult in North Britain may be the key to his association with North Wales and a Welsh saint called by the Hebrew name Asaph. The patron of the eponymous see based at Flanelli near Rhuddlan. The diocese of Flanelli occupies the northeastern quarter of Wales, encompassing the old counties of Denbighshire, Flintshire, and Montgomeryshire. Whatever its earlier history, there'd been no bishops in the area for a considerable time before the foundation or refoundation of the bishopric in 1141. The first bishop of the refounded bishopric of Flanelli, a shadowy figure by the name of Richard, given his name a man of Anglo-Norman extraction, was consecrated in 1141. The earliest mention of Kentigern's connection with Flanelli and with Asaph is made by Jocelyn in the life of St. Kentigern. In the portion of that work that deals with the exile of Kentigern and the founding of the bishopric of St. Asaph, Kentigern escapes from the avenging relatives of Morcan, king of Cumbria, who dies of gout after kicking Kentigern. Kentigern makes for St. David's in South Wales, where he meets and lives with St. David. King Cadwallon befriends him and gives him a site called Nant Carvan, where he founds a monastery. Then a white boar leads him to a place on the banks of the River Elwy. He and his followers begin to build a monastery, but they are stopped by a heathen prince, apparently a subject of King Cadwallon. He orders the monastery to be pulled down, but is struck blind. The prince then repents, and when Kentigern is recalled to the north, Asaph becomes his successor as abbot and bishop. My strong suspicion is that Geoffrey of Monmouth had a hand in Jocelyn's story. Geoffrey of Monmouth was the author of the History of the Kings of Britain and the Life of Merlin, which popularized the legend of King Arthur and introduced the story of King Lear. A copy of the Life of Merlin was bound in the same manuscript as the first fragmentary life of St. Kentigern, and there are several intriguing similarities in material between the Life of Merlin and Jocelyn's Life of St. Kentigern. A further link with Geoffrey may be visible in Jocelyn's work, for it's in the Life of St. Kentigern that we find our earliest record of the connection of Kentigern with the See of Llanelwy. There are, I think, some strong grounds for the idea that Geoffrey of Monmouth first linked the persons of Asaph and Kentigern, and so associated St. Kentigern with Llanelwy. Geoffrey was consecrated as Bishop of Llanelwy in 1152, and it's with Geoffrey that the name St. Asaph as a place name is first applied to the see. With his customary disregard for historical fact, Geoffrey appears to have looked about for a patron of his new see to rival Llandaff, where his literary rival, Caradog of Llancarvan, was closely tied to the episcopal household, and for whose official history Geoffrey had displayed contemptuous disregard in his own work. In his research, Geoffrey must have alighted on a version of Annales Cambriae where, as we've already seen, the death notice recorded beside that of Llandaff's main patron, Dyfrig, is of none other than Kentigern. Once again, we can look to the contemporary context to tell us about the significance of the stories told about our patron saints. So let's return now to St Kentigern, St Mungo, and to Glasgow. We may now conclude that the dedications to St Kentigern, Bishop and Confessor in Cumberland and Wales appear to be essentially a product of the 12th century. In those areas controlled by the kings of Scots, they represent the dominance of that king and of the new bishops of Glasgow. In northeast Wales, the Kentigern connection may be viewed as invention. The spread of dedications in Cumberland, southern Scotland, and the Fourth Clyde belt would normally be explained by royal and high-powered aristocratic patronage. It's not until the 12th century that we can see any sign that Kentigern's cult was likely to have been promoted systematically in the Strathclyde area. The churches in Cumberland dedicated to Kentigern almost certainly received their designation in the 12th century. The Lothian connection in Jocelyn's life was probably designed to encourage and justify pre-existing dedications to Kentigern in that area. In the end, I think we can interpret the spread of Kentigern's cult as a phenomenon closely bound up with the rise of Glasgow as an episcopal see in the 12th century. The re-emergence, the promotion, and the growth of St Kentigern as a figure for veneration during the 12th century was a process related to changes in the Scottish kingdom, the reorganization of the bishoprics of Scotland, and the reform of the churches of Western Christendom at that time. These changes came about partly from Anglo-Norman political ambitions in northern Britain, partly in the wake of a reordering of the English episcopate after the Norman conquest, and partly as a response to the swelling metropolitical claims of York. Kentigern was made into a figure who could represent the history of a kingdom and its Christian community in a new way. He became a bridge between the dignified past of a refashioned historical memory and the confident, aspirant reality of the present. Kentigern's story interpreted the contemporary situation for a 12th century audience. A developing Scottish realm of diverse cultural, linguistic, and ecclesiastical constituents. St Kentigern, as he appears in the sources, is really a later recreation of an earlier artifact. In the same way that Barry and Pugin in the mid-19th century built a Palace of Westminster to house and embody a reformed parliament, the seat of a government that ruled over an expanding empire, so the 12th century bishops of Glasgow built a cathedral for the heart of their reformed and expanding diocese and commissioned histories of its founding bishop, whose newly constructed shrine stood at its heart. Embedded in the core of these histories may lie an original edifice of 6th century historical reality, but it has been lost to modern view. We're only able to observe the embellished reconstruction, which was raised for a contemporary purpose and to serve contemporary needs. Such figures as Glasgow's Bishop Jocelyn and his namesake Jocelyn of Furness, not to mention Flanelli's Geoffrey, may be compared to Charles Barry and Augustus Pugin, the one building the grand structure, the other decorating it with a pseudo-historical flourish. Just as our view of the Gothic has been influenced by the 19th century, we should also recognize the extent to which our view of the Age of Saints has been conditioned by the 12th. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, for a very learned and fascinating presentation, and what a wonderful opening lecture for us this year. Thank you so much for the time and effort you've taken to produce such an amazing lecture. We already have some questions coming in, nice, thick and fast. So we'll start with the first one. It's from Mark. I'll read it out to you, John. What are the similarities you mentioned between the life of Kentigern and Merlin, which you mentioned earlier in your presentation? Is it specific miracles or just the general structure?
It's mainly the story around the Lilican legend and the wild man who appears the figure appears as a jester or homo fatuus in Jocelyn's life of Kentigern, and there are also a few other bits and pieces, like some linguistic overlaps, it seems, in some of the language of the preface, and a couple of other elements. So it's mainly that, and it's this sort of coincidence of the life, Geoffrey's life of Merlin being bound up with the Herbertian, the fragmentary life of Kentigern, in that same dossier, which suggests that there had at some point been a dossier which which went along with the life of Merlin, with the life of Kentigern, where material by Geoffrey of Monmouth had played some kind of role. And the other, just to go a bit further, to perhaps elaborate on why I think Geoffrey of Monmouth had some kind of a hand, not directly, but that Jocelyn was picking up on Geoffrey of Monmouth's ideas. The kind of thing that we find in Jocelyn's life of St. Kentigern written about the history of the church in Wales, like Kentigern founding a monastery at Nant Carvan, and for example, that's the most obvious one. Caradog of Llan Carvan was probably a contemporary of Geoffrey at maybe in Paris, but the idea, but he probably had a hand in the writing of one of the most interesting works of the history of the church in South Wales of the 12th century, the Book of Llandaff, and certainly an author of saints' lives, and the idea that his ecclesiastical home, Nant Carvan, Llan Carvan, had been founded from St. David's by St. Kentigern is a poke in the eye. And it's not the kind of thing that Jocelyn would necessarily have known to do on his own. It sounds like just the kind of thing Geoffrey of Monmouth would have done. And so what was going on at Llandaff was again a recreation or creation from new of a diocese that hadn't really been there before. And the principal saint is Dyfrig, who is seen as the great founder of the Church of the Southern Britons. And of course, in the Annales Cambriae, dying at the same time is Kentigern. So what Geoffrey was doing, probably the idea that Kentigern was a founder of St. Asaph, might be coming from Geoffrey, saying, well, Llandaff, the big rival to the south, was founded by Dyfrig. Well, the church in North Wales was founded by this famous Saint Kentigern, the other great saint of the Britons. So I hope that helps explain a bit more what I'm talking about.
I'm going to give a couple of very quick questions, John, which you can answer very quickly. Then we'll move on to some of the deeper ones. And thanks you so much, everybody, for giving us questions. And also, John, I would have to say an awful lot of praise for the lecture. People are absolutely delighted by it, and it's quite influential people here giving you some praise, so that's good. What was the volume that you displayed on your PowerPoint?
Oh, I'm afraid that's the cheating a bit there. That's the facsimile of the life of Kentigern in that's facsimile, the manuscript in Marsh's Library in Dublin, which is in St Mungo's in the cathedral, and so you can go there and see that. Okay, so it's not a picture of the real one, but it's the one that's in Glasgow. So.
A question you probably anticipated, and I think you did kind of cover it at the beginning, but never mind. Where and when does the name Mungo appear to refer to him? You've referred to Kentigern throughout, so where and when does the name Mungo appear to refer to him?
Yeah, you get a lot in place names. Now, when does it actually? I mean, it's. Does it bear in life? But it's a, you know, it's a diminutive. It's a hypochoristic form. You know, it takes the first element of his name, the kun bit, which is the hound bit, and adds and sticks on the front a sort of possessive mu, and so that you know, it's kind of, you know, like our Johnny, you know. So.
Okay, some questions that I'm not sure if you're able to answer these or not, but I'll give them to you anyway. That they are interesting. From Thomas Back, if Pope Alexander III was so positively inclined towards the Bishop Jocelyn and Scotland in general, that he made Glasgow and then all Scottish bishoprics into special daughters of Rome, why didn't he canonize St Kentigern?
He didn't really need to at that stage. Did he? Do
you know what? That's as good as answer as any.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, you know, that process sort of comes in, you know, in the 12th century and late, and sort of carries on. Basically, if you've got a holy bishop and you've got the relics and you've built a cathedral on top of it, that's good enough. Great.
Another one that's a fascinating one from Lorna D. Carter, and you've put this on twice, Lorna, which is great. Given that the burial archaeology for Govan dates to the 5th, 6th century, were the pagan, inverted commas, pagan kings of Strathclyde as pagan as hagiographies suggest?
Well, I suppose not. I think it can be. I mean, there seems to be a you know, yeah. I'm just trying to think. There was, you know, certainly some converting going on in the 6th and 7th centuries, but whether, you know, to the extent to which it was the kings who were being converted, because, you know, it seems that, you know, Columba himself was actually, you know, wasn't coming to convert kings; he was being invited. So it seems there was already, you know, Christianization, but you know, it's a question of evangelizing the surrounding countryside, I suppose.
Okay, here's an interesting one about the connection between North Wales and Strathclyde. So it's from Paul Matheson. There seems to be a remarkably persistent cultural and religious connection between North Wales and the Old North of Cumbria, Reged and Strathclyde, how long does Strathclyde's awareness continue of being regarded by the medieval Welsh as being part of their lost patrimony?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I wonder to the extent to which Jocelyn and maybe Geoffrey too, although he had a certain disdain for the actual Welsh and the sort of North British himself, only thinking that the Bretons were only those worthy of the name of Britain. But I'm wondering, to what extent this was being sort of re-emphasized in the 12th, throughout the 12th century. And I mean, you're even getting it, for example, in that in the office for St. Kentigern in the Spruceton Breviary. If you remember, I think it was part of the festival a few years ago, where there was a performance of the Vespers of St. Kentigern at St. Mungo's Cathedral. I was one of the singers, actually. But there's a, what is it? It's a, whatever the, it's a responsory, in septentrionali valia. So in which Betty not right translated as in northern Welshland, which is rather nice. So, but the point is, Kentigern in his office is seen as, in some sense, someone of North Wales, whether North Wales means Strathclyde or North Wales in a modern sense. So you can see that sort of continuing in that sense right through, and and it'll be going right through to the office in which appears in the Aberdeen Breviary too.
Question from David Brown. I'll just read out the praise as well, John. I think it's pretty good. That was a brilliant exposition of highly complex material, John. Many thanks indeed. Virtuoso scholarship. I think I would agree with that. Do you see potential 12th century or earlier significance in the connection between St. Kentigern and St. Serf?
Interesting. Yeah, I'm wondering whether, I mean, there's a theory, at least, that the fragmentary life of Kentigern was written by Simeon, Archdeacon of Teviotdale, and this is on stylistic grounds, and there's overlap with the life of serf. So you might have had some commissioning going on there. And you've also got the Cistercian connection. You get the Cistercian, that's in the 13th century, and Curos and Fife, which is the reputed home of St. Serf, and Kentigern, the life of Kentigern makes Serf Kentigern's teacher, And so
do you want to move on, John? To
yeah, I'll have to think a bit more about that.
Okay,
I'm sure there's something really obvious that I'm missing that I can't quite bring to mind.
Some of these are quite tough questions as well. There's a lot. Okay, the one other question we have here is from Marcus Slater. How does this relate to the medieval bishops of Glasgow Palace at Ancram? Now, I've got a website for that. So if you can think of any relationship or connection to the medieval bishops of Glasgow Palace at Ancram.
No idea, I'm afraid.
No idea. Okay.
Sorry.
Nothing. David Brown has also said, no, nothing curious comes to my mind. It was just nothing. I was just curious. Okay. We've time for a couple of very quick questions to finish off. I think we've kind of covered them all. We've covered every single one that we've had, John, and you've done really, really well. Okay, I think. Okay, one final question from Mark again. Is it likely it's actually him in the shrine, buried there?
No. But, actually, I don't know. Is there anything in there now? But you know, that's the problem. Who knows? There's the case of the shrine of St. David was opened, and you know, I think they found the bones were actually from animals because the reliquary had been stolen, in the Middle Ages in a raid. I mean, I don't see why not, actually. I don't want to be cynical about it, and there's no reason. There was a translation, and so presumably that they had been venerated, but there's also a sort of well-known tradition of finding relics that might not have otherwise existed. So, but I don't see why not. Is what I'd like to say. Yeah.
Final question for you before we start winding up. Are there any traces of Kentigern in Welsh myth legend?
Well, yes. I mean, but it's all really around the same kind of body and material. So there is stuff that's independent, circulating independently of the the connection with Asaph and so forth, which comes from sort of St. Asaph Flanelli sources. I'm trying to think whether he actually appears in any what you might call other kind of myth and folk tales and so forth. But there is independent material which has a sort of St. Asaph provenance, independent of Jocelyn, or before Jocelyn. So it's not, although the evidence sort of is from anyway, but there is independent material, but it's I can't think of anything in what you might call more the sort of folktale type stuff away from more explicitly religious material.
Okay, thanks, John. Just a comment from Stephen Driscoll, who delivered this lecture a number of years ago. And I'll just read this out. The site of Mungo's tomb has not been moved since the late 12th century, based on my excavations near the tomb. So yes, Mungo's probably still there. So
well, that's great.
I think if Stephen Driscoll says it's there, it's there. We can all take that.
Oh, that's super.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
John, I'd just like to thank you on behalf of the festival, on behalf of the Medieval Glasgow Trust, for this fantastic opening lecture. the latest in a series of really brilliant lectures. Speaking personally, it's fantastic that you are a colleague, a friend, and also from the University of Glasgow, talking about St. Kentigern, St. Mungo. Thank you so much, as I said at the beginning of the question time, for your time and energy to produce such a fascinating and such a learned lecture. You brought so much scholarship to this evening, and many of the comments are thanking you so much for the scholarship. Obviously, many people appreciate what's been said tonight. And thank you so much for engaging with some of these questions, some of which were a bit thorny and a bit tricky, but really good questions, and a sign that people have really enjoyed your lecture and have engaged with it. So thank you so much.